All right, guys, this is one of those moments that looks quiet on the surface but carries the weight of a turning point underneath it. On a remote stretch of river high in the Tibetan Himalayas, Chinese leaders didn't just launch another infrastructure project, they signaled a shift in how power wants to be seen in the 21st century. This was not framed as routine development, and it was not sold as a local upgrade. It was presented as a declaration that China believes the era of hesitation is over. In a world where major economies struggle to approve airports, bridges, or rail lines, this ceremony sent a different message entirely. It said that scale is back, and ambition is not something to apologize for. This project matters not because of concrete or turbines, but because it tests a core assumption of our time that large systems have become too complex, too risky, or too political to build. China is openly challenging that assumption by placing its credibility on the line. The gamble here is not subtle. It is a bet that engineering capacity, economic coordination, and political resolve can still override geography and inertia. That alone makes this moment important, but there is a deeper layer. This project arrives at a time when global supply chains are fragile, capital is cautious, and public trust in megaprojects is thin. Choosing this moment is intentional. It reframes capability as stability. It suggests that the ability to execute at scale is itself a form of national insurance. The story, therefore, does not begin with electricity. It begins with signaling. This is about telling domestic audiences that momentum still exists and telling global audiences that paralysis is not universal. The opening question is not how much power this dam will produce, but what it reveals about who still believes they can reshape the physical world rather than merely manage decline. Now let's talk about scale, because this is where most people misunderstand what is happening. The instinct is to compare this project to past landmarks and stop there. The Three Gorges Dam has long been treated as the ceiling of human ambition in hydropower. What is being built now does not sit just above that ceiling, it removes it entirely. A planned capacity exceeding 60 gigawatts is not an incremental increase, it is a structural reset. This amount of electricity is enough to power an advanced industrial economy on its own, but the real implication lies elsewhere. Power at this scale forces a redesign of how energy is transmitted, stored, and balanced across regions. It changes grid logic. It demands new forms of long-distance transmission and real-time load management. First-order effects are obvious: more clean power, more stability, more redundancy. Second-order effects are where the shift becomes strategic. When a single project can anchor regional energy planning, it alters investment flows, industrial placement, and even population patterns. Industries cluster around reliability, not just cost. This is why calling it a dam understates its role. It is better understood as a backbone. It establishes a new reference point for what counts as sufficient supply. That reference point then cascades into policy decisions for decades. Once that benchmark exists, everything smaller is reclassified as supplementary. This is how scale becomes influence without being coercive. By redefining normal capacity, China is effectively redefining what energy security looks like for itself. The rest of the world may still debate whether such projects are feasible. China is moving ahead as if that debate has already been settled. At the same time, this project cannot be understood through environmental rhetoric alone, even though that is the language most often used to defend it. Officially, it supports long-term carbon neutrality goals, and that is true at a surface level. Hydropower of this magnitude would displace vast amounts of fossil fuel generation over time. But beneath that public framing sits a far more decisive driver: energy security. Modern economies are only as stable as their access to power, and imported energy always carries exposure. Shipping lanes, currency volatility, and geopolitical shocks all introduce uncertainty. A domestically controlled source of electricity at this scale functions like a strategic reserve that never runs dry. The first-order benefit is insulation from external pressure. The second-order benefit is freedom of maneuver. When energy is secure, policy becomes less reactive. This is why the dam matters beyond emissions targets. It locks in optionality. It allows planners to think in decades rather than quarters. It also reshapes negotiation dynamics because dependence is asymmetric. The country that controls its own energy base negotiates from a different position than one that must constantly hedge supply risk. This project therefore serves two audiences simultaneously. To the outside world, it presents a clean transition narrative. To internal planners, it delivers a structural guarantee that growth does not hinge on global stability. That dual function is what makes it so powerful. It is not just green and it is not just strategic, it is both at once, and that convergence explains why such extraordinary risks are being accepted. So let's zoom out, because the location itself is the key to understanding the deeper strategy. Tibet is not being treated as a remote frontier or a symbolic periphery in this story. It is being engineered as a system. For decades, the Tibetan plateau has been described as the water tower of Asia, because so many of the continent's major rivers originate there. What has changed is not geography, but intent. Over the past 20 years, infrastructure planning in this region has followed a clear logic of integration rather than isolation. Roads, rail lines, power corridors, and data links have quietly transformed altitude into advantage. This dam is not an isolated giant dropped into the mountains. It is the flagship of a network designed to convert elevation into energy and distance into leverage. The first-order impact is straightforward centralized power generation in a place where gravity does the work. The second-order impact is far more consequential. By turning Tibet into an energy engine, the state redefines its role inside the national system. It becomes a provider rather than a burden, a core node rather than a distant edge. That shift matters because systems behave differently than locations. Systems justify continuous investment, long-term planning, and tighter political control. They also justify risk because failure would reverberate nationally. This is why the scale of commitment here feels disproportionate if viewed through a local lens. Through a systems lens, it is logical. The plateau offers altitude water and isolation, all of which reduce competition and increase controllability. In that sense, Tibet becomes a strategic buffer and a strategic asset at the same time. The dam is simply the most visible expression of a decision made years ago that the future grid would run through the roof of the world rather than around it. Now here is where engineering stops being incremental and starts becoming confrontational. The Yarlung Changpo River does something extraordinary at the Great Bend. It slams into some of the hardest rock on Earth and makes an abrupt turn, carving one of the deepest canyons on the planet. For hydropower, this is both a dream and a nightmare. The energy potential is enormous, but traditional dam construction in such terrain is nearly impossible. Landslides, seismic instability, and sheer depth make surface solutions fragile. That is why the approach being discussed is so radical. Instead of forcing the river to behave, they are planning to bypass the problem entirely. By tunneling through the mountain, the river's natural loop is replaced with a straight artificial drop. This creates an immense vertical fall that can drive turbines with unprecedented force. It is not adaptation, it is rule changing. The first-order consequence is efficiency. Water moved through tunnels can be controlled, precisely reducing surface exposure. The second-order consequence is precedent. If this works, the global limits of hydropower engineering are rewritten. Mountains stop being obstacles and become conduits. That changes the calculus for future projects worldwide. But this is also why outside observers are so stunned. This is geographic surgery performed at continental scale. It demands precision over distances measured in kilometers under rock that does not forgive error. The tolerances are brutal. The margin for miscalculation is thin. Yet this approach reflects a broader mindset. When geography resists, do not negotiate with it, redesign it. That mentality is what leaves experienced engineers both impressed and uneasy, because success would unlock a new class of megaprojects, while failure would confirm why such limits existed in the first place. But here's the rub. Every breakthrough described so far collides with a reality that cannot be engineered away. This region sits on one of the most active tectonic zones on Earth. The Himalayas exist because continental plates are still grinding against each other. Earthquakes are not anomalies here. They are structural features of the landscape. Any structure placed in this environment is not tested against probability, but against inevitability. Engineers can design for known forces. They can model stress absorption, flexible joints, and shock resistance. What they cannot fully eliminate is tail risk, a low probability event with catastrophic consequences. The first-order risk is obvious structural failure during a major quake or a glacial lake outburst flood triggered upstream. The second-order risk is systemic. If something goes wrong in a place, this remote response times or long information flow is constrained and cascading failures become harder to contain. This is why the project represents more than ambition. It represents a wager on control in an environment defined by volatility. Supporters argue that modern engineering has reached a level where even these risks can be managed. Critics counter that scale magnifies consequences faster than resilience. Both views can be true at once. What matters is that this dam becomes a benchmark not just for success, but for acceptable exposure. If it holds, future megaprojects gain legitimacy in extreme environments. If it does not, the entire category becomes politically radioactive. This is why the cost of ambition here is not just measured in billions, but in how much uncertainty a system is willing to normalize in pursuit of dominance. Now, let's follow the water, because this story does not stop at the border, and this is where infrastructure quietly turns into diplomacy. The river being harnessed here does not belong to one country in a practical sense, even if it originates within one. As it flows downstream, it becomes a lifeline for agriculture cities and ecosystems across South Asia. Millions of people depend on its seasonal rhythms, not just for irrigation, but for soil renewal and floodplain fertility. When a project of this magnitude appears upstream, it changes perception instantly. Even if engineers insist the dam is designed primarily for power generation and not storage, the scale alone introduces a sense of vulnerability. Control becomes the issue. The first order concern downstream is predictability. Rivers are not just volumes of water, they are timing mechanisms. Altering flow patterns, even subtly, can disrupt planting cycles, fisheries, and sediment transport. The second order consequence is political. Water management becomes inseparable from trust, and trust is fragile when asymmetry exists. An upstream actor does not need to weaponize a river for leverage to be felt. The mere capacity to influence flow creates diplomatic gravity. This is how natural systems become strategic variables. The river shifts from being a shared environmental fact to a negotiated condition. That transformation forces new conversations, whether formal or informal. It also raises stakes during crises because infrastructure decisions can be misread as signals. This is why downstream nations watch construction schedules and design hints so closely. They are not looking for sabotage scenarios, but for reassurance. In that sense, the dam extends China's strategic footprint without deploying a single asset beyond its territory. Geography does the work. This is the paradox of megastructures on shared rivers. They promise efficiency and stability domestically while exporting uncertainty regionally. Managing that tension requires transparency and coordination, yet those mechanisms are often slower than construction itself. The result is a long-term diplomatic balancing act where engineering timelines move faster than confidence building. Let's talk about the price tag, because the number itself is doing heavy lifting. $167 billion is not simply an accounting figure, it is a declaration of capacity. Domestically, this level of spending acts like a multi-year stimulus targeted at high-value sectors. It sustains advanced engineering firms, materials, science research, logistics networks, and skilled labor pipelines. The first order effect is economic momentum in industries that define future competitiveness. The second order effect is institutional confidence. Large projects train bureaucracies to coordinate across ministries, timelines, and risk profiles. That capability compounds over time. But the message is equally external. In a global environment where many governments struggle to fund or execute projects, a fraction of this size, the ability to mobilize capital and follow through, becomes a form of soft power. It signals that constraints elsewhere are not universal. This matters because credibility today is often judged by execution rather than promises. Anyone can announce targets, fewer can pour concrete at scale. The dam, therefore, becomes a benchmark for state capacity in the 21st century. It invites comparison not only on energy output, but on governance effectiveness. That comparison influences investment perceptions, alliance expectations, and long-term planning assumptions. It also shifts the psychological ceiling of what is considered feasible. Once a project of this magnitude is underway, other nations must reassess their own limits, whether financial, political, or technical. This is how influence propagates indirectly, not by coercion, but by redefining normal. The cost here buys more than power generation. It buys narrative momentum. It reinforces the idea that some states can still commit to transformational undertakings, while others debate incremental fixes. In that contrast lies much of the project's global impact. So we arrive at the unresolved question because for all the analysis, the final verdict remains unwritten. The future of this project branches into three broad paths. In the first scenario, the engineering holds the risks are contained and the system performs as designed. If that happens, the global baseline for megaprojects shifts permanently. Extreme geography becomes negotiable and ambition regains legitimacy. In the second scenario, success is partial. Power flows and goals are met, but environmental and diplomatic costs accumulate over time. The dam works, yet it carries persistent friction. That outcome still reshapes energy planning but embeds long-term tension into regional relationships. The third scenario is the counterintuitive one. Nothing collapses catastrophically, but the cumulative complexity overwhelms benefits. Maintenance costs uncertainty, and political sensitivity gradually outweigh the advantages. The structure stands, yet its symbolism changes from triumph to warning. What all three paths share is significance. This project cannot be ignored because it tests how modern systems absorb scale. The core thesis returns here. This is not a story about concrete or turbines. It is about how power is demonstrated in an era where confidence is scarce. Some nations manage decline, others attempt reinvention. This dam represents a belief that physical transformation is still possible and still worth the risk. Whether history rewards that belief depends on variables not fully visible yet. The blueprint details, environmental trade-offs, and emergency protocols remain opaque. Those unknowns are where judgment will eventually land. For now, the only certainty is that the attempt itself has altered expectations. It forces everyone else to ask uncomfortable questions about capacity, risk tolerance, and ambition. So the real issue is not whether this dam will work, but what it reveals about who is willing to try. Do you think this project will redefine what is possible, or will it become the cautionary line future planners refuse to cross? And what does it say about a world where building big has become the exception rather than the rule? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.